Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my big overview of Legion Alpha. I will warn you, there are going to be visual spoilers, but no audio spoilers, okay? I will be referencing things that you'll be able to see on the screen, but not outright saying them. So I think that's a fair system, so you can minimize now, and you will be able to listen without fear and of any spoilers in terms of the zones and all that kind of stuff. But the guys who want to watch the video, they can absolutely see it, okay? So without further ado, go. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to look at various things. So I have to answer a number of subjects. We're going to look at the classes. We're going to look at the zones. We're going to look at the artifact quest lines. We're going to look at the dungeons. We're going to talk about all these things and my impressions of them. I think we should start with the classes first, because it's been pretty clear I've been way less enthusiastic about releasing the class looks than I was with anything else in Legion so far, including I mean, you can look at the vigor and the enthusiasm, and I engulfed myself essentially in doing the artifact quest lines, and then it came to the class stuff, and I was like, whoa, pop the brakes a little bit here. Something's a little bit off. So I think I want to explain that in a little bit more clearer detail, and also look at some of the pros and some of the cons that are going on with the classes right now. So, the problem is, one, I truly believe, and I think we need to set this pace now, I truly believe this version of the Legion Alpha, this build we got, was pretty much purely to test out the artifact quest lines that were currently finished, and not much else at all. Potentially the zones are included there, but realistically speaking, they were looking to get the artifact quest lines done. Now, the problem with that is the classes are clearly miles away from being finished, and in nearly all cases are flat out broken. Broken to the point where giving any sort of reasonable detailed looks and discussion on them is almost impossible, if not completely irrelevant at this point in the game. We are like 6 months away from live. If you don't know this because you weren't here for WoD, or you didn't follow my channel in WoD Alpha, the damage balancing and all that kind of stuff, like what your attacks will hit for, all the generations and stuff, it actually doesn't occur till like a week before it goes live. I'm not joking. It's like a week before, and even then, as we saw over Walls of Draenor, that they were constantly shifting the numbers. They never nailed it down. They never nailed it down over the entirety of WoD, and basically gave up at this point. We've seen class changes recently, but they've kind of given up, despite the fact that some classes are clearly way too powerful, purely because bosses are dying so quickly, and the game doesn't really need it right now, that they just don't give a shit. It's all about Legion and all the stuff leading towards it. So, with that being said, everything you look at, and I always preface the videos with this, is you're looking at stuff that's not working, nowhere near what it's supposed to do, and in general is giving you numbers that don't make any sense. The problem with that, of course, is that I put in a minimum, unless I tell you specifically otherwise, I put in a minimum of 6 to 7 hours per spec before I will even do a 15 to 20 minute talk on it. At least. I owe that to every single one of you, to sit down and play the shit out of it before I even open my fucking mouth about it. It'd be far easier for me to log in, read some tooltips, and go, hey guys, here's the fucking spec, so I could spam videos out to you like some fucking lemming. I don't do that. I don't care about that stuff. I've got a nice point in my channel now where I can take a couple of days in order to review something properly and then give a proper discussion on it. And that's paid off for us long term, especially for those guys who aren't so impatient as to need something every single minute. So that doesn't really answer the question of why I've been less enthused about releasing them. With them being so broken right now, there is a serious concern that anything I'm talking about, one, is a waste of your time, two, I can't demonstrate it, and three, is completely just going to make you upset, angry, and annoyed needlessly. And that's a big problem for me. I consider myself an entertainer first. This is just the medium that I do it. What I want to do is make you guys happy. That's why I have things like the drama show where we get really silly. That's why we have the web show where we just talk shit and have a giggle. And although I'm very, very deeply embedded and rooted in the core mechanics of World of Warcraft, it's more a case of presenting that information in a way that's, one, is palatable and hopefully leaves you with a little smile on your face. Let me tell you right now, playing a broken spec for 6 or 7 hours and then making a video that is about how broken it is and how shit this spec looks at this current version, if you think it's bad for you to listen to, imagine what it's like for me to make. It's like the worst feeling ever. It's like, okay, I'm going to put this video out in front of tens of thousands of people and they're going to be pissed off with it. What a fucking good day's work that is. So that's something that's really playing on my mind, and I was doing them back to back because so many of the specs are broken. And the reason I say that is that they finished a lot of the artifact quests, but how can they let us test the artifact quests without giving us the class to be able to do it? We can look at things like the Ret Paladin, the Shadow Priest, so on and so forth, that are clearly, flat out, fundamentally broken in many ways. The Death Knights that have had core abilities like Runic Empowerment and Runic Corruption broken. The specs do not play like they're supposed to play at all. Not even fucking close. But how can we test the Frost Death Knight artifacts or the Unholy or the Ret Paladin or the Shadow Priest without giving people the classes to do them on? We can't. So then they were stuck in this weird scenario where it was like, okay, well, we're going to have to activate these specs because these are the artifact quest lines we have working, and let people go in there and sort of muddle through. And that is exactly what we are doing. That is exactly what we're all doing right now. It's just muddling through as best we can. We look at what we should spec, how it should play, it doesn't work. So then we go into the talents and we go, well, this one's actually overpowered. These two are broken or not working or not even close to this overpowered one. So what you do is you spec the way that probably works and you go ahead and you play with that. Why? Because why the hell wouldn't you? If I'm going to level something for 6 or 7 hours, right? Am I going to spend a little bit of time with talents that don't work and things that say not yet implemented and go, okay, well, they don't work and this isn't implemented. And then ultimately, I'm going to switch over to the thing that allows me to level at a decent pace. Because I'm not crazy, right? And none of us are crazy. But the distinction there is when it comes to presenting this class to you guys, we have to point out like, okay, this isn't working right. That's not working right. And what I've seen so far from the feedback, I had to change the format of the quick looks from this because I would like to come in and say, this is mega cool. This is mega cool. You should be hyped for this. You should totally be hyped for this. I'm excited by this. I've had fun with this. What I'm actually doing is coming in and say, right, first of all, this spec is broken. 2, the damage doesn't work. 3, the talents aren't implemented. 4, the artifact quests, some of these spells don't even work or they don't interact properly. Some of these talents seem to be activated by default, even though I've not spec'd into them. Let's have a look at how it plays. Now, most of you have actually been super awesome about this. And what I've noticed is the ones that I've blasted, absolutely blasted, like the Outlaw Rogue, the dislike system isn't anything to do with my critique. It's more a case of I dislike what Blizzard's done with my spec. I totally respect that. And I think that's an awesome system where I can gauge the general feeling of the crowd, because I don't take dislikes personally, right? And if you guys are like, yeah, I really dislike this, and I read the comments, it's like, nobody's saying that what I'm saying is wrong here. What they're saying is they dislike what's happened. That's cool. Totally okay with that. So I have been absolutely less enthused with that because it's hard to start every video with, this is broken, this isn't working, this isn't working. Like I said with the Death Knights, people are like, where's the Death Knight videos? The Death Knights are totally broken on Legion Alpha. They're absolutely broken. So what I'm going to demonstrate for you is something that isn't working. I might as well get a toaster, have it fucking broken, and be like, okay, here's a toaster, it's supposed to toast bread, but it doesn't fucking work right now. So, this is what's supposed to happen, is you're supposed to press this button down, the bread will go in, it'll then fucking heat up and turn to toast, and then it'll pop up based on the timer you've set. Pretty easy. But what I'm actually going to show you is a toaster that doesn't work on the button, the bread doesn't toast, it doesn't pop up, and generally it's a big fucking waste of time. So you might say, why are you releasing the videos at all, Preacher? You would absolutely be correct in asking that question, but at the same time, I kind of owe it to the tens and tens of thousands of people per spec who are like, I just want to know, good or bad, where is my spec right now? What's happening with it? And we can also, as we've tried to do, and I've really tried to do, is look at things in terms of, yes, this is broken, this isn't working right, but this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're supposed to do. This is the way it's intended to play, and we think this is where it's going, this is the direction, and now we could talk about whether or not we like that direction. Although I can't demonstrate it properly or really get much hands-on with it, what we can do is talk about whether or not that's cool and interesting. So let's talk about the pros. I hope you understand now where I'm coming from with that. Let's talk about the pros. So far, I will say that the artifact system, while is clearly arbitrary gating, right? It's gating off various abilities and making you make some choice. Having choice is cool. So we have this dual system of talents, and instead of making that just even more bigger and bloated, the artifact system makes a lot of sense as to why it exists. It exists as something that can be changed in the future without being overly committed. They can test things out there, and it does that job. They are clearly already seeing the routes people are taking through their artifact weapons in order to reach certain traits. So it's all about those 4 or 5 traits that you get. That's it. What they have in between is just artificial gating. Yeah? So if you're a Fury Warrior that focuses on Rampage, which is where that spec's going right now, looking at your artifact weapon, you're obviously going to take the stuff that's in between that focuses on Rampage, but you're more interested in the routes you're going to take to get to your traits. I'm happy with that. It gives a reasonable sense of progression over the course of the expansion. Hopefully it's not a huge grind. And if that is the case, I am more than happy with how the artifact system works. It is clearly arbitrary gating, but it does give that sense of progression. Each point, you are excited to get the artifact power to get the next one and move forward and move ever closer towards those important traits. And then you get to make choices to branch off. It's fine. It works. It's totally cool. I am totally fine with it. It's definitely a system that needs as many arbitrary traits as it has in order to give that sense of progression and unlocking. I'm okay with that. It happens passively as you play the game. You'll gain artifact power from whatever you want to do. No problems whatsoever. No problems whatsoever. Now, let's talk about the negatives. The clear gutting of any form of class interaction is my biggest worry for Legion so far. I have just spent a few minutes there talking about how a lot of the specs are broken. However, some of them aren't broken, right? They need tweaking, but they're not broken. And I mean broken as in you can't play these specs as they are supposed to be played. There are some specs that are clearly not that way. They are in fact, seemingly pretty close to what they're going to. I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty good on this stuff, man. That's what I do. Like, over the last few expansions where we've covered the alphas, 95% have been bang on with these predictions. So, in that vein, some of these specs don't seem that far away from where they're supposed to go. And nearly every single one of them has had all form of class and spell interaction and gameplay interaction and choices removed. And I don't really know why. I have my theories. It's due to the fact that people are making way more alts recently, and they know they can't supply enough content that's going to keep everybody happy on one character for a really extended period of time. And people are leveling so quickly through heirlooms, through boosts, and the fact that you don't need to play your class an awful lot. And in fact, people are rolling specs that they don't intend to even play endgame. People are capping their characters before they even go to their spec that they re-rolled for. Is that a lot of these interactions are being used less and less or used incorrectly and are actually causing punishment rather than the benefit they're supposed to do. That's kind of my theory on it. I'll let you guys decide that. So the problem is player burnout, and I see this as potentially in this early stage. Now, bear in mind, we can only get to level 104, right? Let's put this in some context. We can only get it to level 104, and some of these are fundamentally broken, right? So this is more a case of the direction I see things going. And I say this with the confidence that if there was some mechanics to come for every single spec that currently aren't in the game, at least one of them would have some glimmer that that's going to exist, right? It makes sense that, yeah, it's okay that some of the specs would be missing what their kind of class interaction. I could live with that. None of them really have any. Beyond the RNG that the game is managing. Okay? So, this class interaction choice does lead to player burnout. Player burnout can absolutely come from playing too hard. Certainly if you're a core member of a team, then you feel obliged to turn up to every organized event your guild is doing, whether it be raiding, RBGs, arena, PvP. You absolutely feel obliged if you're a fundamental part of that. Your threes team isn't going to be too happy if one of you doesn't show up. Your rated BG team isn't going to be too happy if you're the flag carrier, or some sort of top DPSer in a raid guild is kind of expecting you to be there, and you do feel obliged to get there. So, in that respect, player burnout occurs because people just feel the need to turn up. And it also happens, of course, if you're wiping too often, and people don't particularly like that. But player burnout can also absolutely occur if your spec is absolutely boring as balls. There's nothing going to make you relive or re-roll your class, your main, or whatever it might be, quicker than just being bored to tits on what you're actually doing. And this could be a potentially huge problem. Let me give some examples here. So we look at a Windwalker monk that has had all its debuff and buff management absolutely removed. And Storm, Earth and Fire, one of the key most unique aspects of that spec, removed and basically retooled to be super easy, super on and off toggle rather than controlled, predictive, choices to be made there, all that stripped away in favor of a system that is kind of okay, but it's something that your fingers, and I said this in the video, your fingers train to do the hit combo mechanic in about 5 to 10 minutes. If you've played a Windwalker before, you're going to have no issue with this whatsoever. Probably by the end of your artifact quest, you'll be more than fine with this system and only letting it fall off when you do that random goof up. But generally speaking, you're fine with it. We could look at the Outlaw Rogue, and this is kind of the example of people who re-roll stuff and kind of goof around with it for a bit, but then re-roll it, is that Bandit's Guile is something that a lot of people considered a random buff that was going up, and it's not. That's an interactive part of the spec, And when you get good at it, and you get advanced with it, and you start to get really comfortable with just the idea of doing finishes and stuff, you start looking at this and going, oh shit, maybe there's something else here, and you start to progress as a player, you get better, all that kind of stuff is going on. We can look at the Ret Paladin with the sheer amount of procs, and while there are definitely lots of people who hate the RNG involved with it, absolutely none of the people who played a Ret Paladin can deny the glory you feel when all of that RNG works in your favor. It's a tremendous moment when it goes perfectly. It's annoying. It's only ever. You've got to understand, in order to be completely fucking frustrated with something and annoyed by it, it's because when it works correctly, it's so much better. And you have that pendulum swing where it's like, God, this could be so much better because of the interaction and the things that can occur with my spec. We still have lots of choices to be made. You can talent around it. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. But now that is gone. Seemingly, it's completely gone. We can look at the Shadow Priest, which has this system of entering Insanity mode, which, despite the graphic lacking, which I'm sure they will put in, the point of the matter is, in order to not just let that control your gameplay, you have to actually physically stop playing. All the important spells you have, Mind Blast, Mind Flay, cause you to go into that phase. Players want the choice to activate this kind of stuff. Why? Because I don't trust the game to work around my spec, especially in a world of so many specs. Having the choice to do it and seeing the results of that is way more interesting than the frustration of it works, it doesn't work, especially when it's in such a manner that it's guaranteed to work less often than it's going to work perfectly. That is guaranteed to happen. But you can't prevent it. There are some occasions historically where people have played specs suboptimally. We can look at the Spine of Deathwing as a Demonology Warlock, where you played suboptimally in between the plates in order to reset, use your class mechanics and the class interactions to force your spec to reset its demon form when it was a cooldown. You played suboptimally, but it was actually the best way for the fight because you abused the class mechanics. You used the knowledge of your class and the way it worked to make that happen. Now, if we look at the Shadow Priest with something similar, and what we have now is if I don't want to go into Void form until a certain time, I literally have to stop playing. I just have to take my hands off the keyboard, or I have to dot things, and that's about it. And that is super weak sauce. It's like, oh, the only way I can actually fight this is to not play. And nobody wants that. We can look at the Survival Hunter, when we can look at the idea that this spec is built entirely around Mongoose Bite. But that is purely at the mercy of the game, yet again. Purely at the mercy of the game. You can keep that buff up for 30 seconds, or you can keep it up for minutes. Purely based on whether or not the game rolls in your favor. Nothing to do with how you play or anything like that. Sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it'll be bad. It is nothing to do with you as a player. The game will dictate that for you. It is out of your hands. And while some people might think that that's better because it's easier, it's not my fault. I can blame other things. You're only going to have a short-term window where that applies to you. And ultimately, you're going to come down to the point is this is boring as fuck. It is super boring. I am basically just along for the ride. It was the big problem I had with the Moonkins, is that you were just along for the ride. And that's happening more and more and more at the moment, and it's certainly my biggest concern for Legion going forward. I also want to bring up the idea that AoE, as a sort of passive that a lot of DPSs get, is definitely being shifted away in a lot of cases towards having to commit to it. What you could do right now, and have been historically able to do, is pick up maybe one talent to boost your AoE, but generally speaking, even if you didn't do that, because you only needed some AoE during a fight, is that you could kind of leave it alone because your natural AoE that your spec comes with was more than enough when combined with your friends to get the job done while returning to what's important, which will be either a single target or whatever. What we're seeing in Legion is that some specs flat out just don't have any AoE. We can look at the Ret Paladin that only has Divine Storm, yet they have access to potentially 5 or 6 talents that give them the ability to AoE. And we are potentially, and I'm not saying this is a definite, this is one of the most spurious ideas I've had, but I can see it as things say similar to now. I mean, it's easy for me to say this spec is broken, but I don't know. They might stay pretty similar. It's entirely possible. And what we might end up with is a situation where we'll only have certain specs AoEing, certainly in a raid environment, because it is not worth the single target sacrifice that you have to make with some specs in order to do AoE effectively. you are wasting your time and single target DPS by trying to cope with those who could do it much easier. Or if we need more, we're going to have people who are just dedicated, who will sacrifice all their single target damage to just be the AoEers, because there's no point in anyone else contributing whatsoever, because it's a huge DPS loss to even bother. Huge DPS loss to even bother. And you might say, there's been certain encounters where we only had certain people AoE. Sure, we could look at Imperator Margok and say, well, we had the Enhancement Shamans doing it. Or we could look at fights like the Beast Lord and say, yeah, well, we only had certain classes AoEing then. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about on a fight-by-fight basis. If there's any AoE to be done, there'll be only certain people doing it, because other people simply cannot. Whereas you could certainly say, well, some people focus on AoE at Beast Lord. Everybody was contributing in some manner to the AoE on that fight. Right? That is generally the case. Only a few people, like the rogues, like I went pure single target, but I was absolutely in a minority. We're talking about a situation where you literally can't pull off any form of AoE whatsoever unless you spec into it. And that could be a potential problem for a lot of people. Being really unhappy is that they are so useless. And that could lead to another situation which needs to be considered, is that people will see bigger numbers if they're doing huge AoE. And if you're not as an educated player or not committed to anything, you'll absolutely be spending your time AoEing and cheesing for all intents and purposes and just looking at a boss that doesn't die. And the reason for that is you're sacrificing so much damage to take part in this AoE bonanza that you're just failing. Another problem that I've had notably, especially while leveling, is that you encounter all varieties of this situation while you're out in the open world. You'll be single targeting some mini bosses, you'll be cleaving 1 or 2 mobs, or you'll be AoEing a lot of small mobs. That variety causes huge problems for a number of classes right now, because you just don't have the tools at your disposal, and you're absolutely not going to be respecking talents in between quest mobs. You're not going to be like, okay, my next quest mobs here needs to respec, so I'll respec, and then kill 4 mobs, and then move on and be like, okay, this is single target, I'm going to respec again. Now, while you can respec quickly, nobody's doing that. But honestly, with some specs, if you don't do that, you're going to die. In a lot of cases, you're going to die, or you simply cannot do the pulls that you want to do. So I'm really not sure what's going on with that whatsoever. It seems very, very bizarre, and I'm not into it. I'm really not into it. Let's move on to the Artifact quest lines. I'm actually really impressed with them. Really impressed with them. Yes, it was disappointing to see that out of the 13 or so we got, or 11, that 3 of them were repeats. It is disappointing, and we would like to see them being purely dedicated. I will give, in my personal opinion, a little bit of leniency there. Part of me says there is no excuse for there not being individually specific artifact questlines for each spec, as it's such a main focus of Legion. But another part of me says this is something you're going to do once for about 20 minutes and never come back to. So while I've seen definitely some repeats going on, right? I've seen some repeat artifact questlines. I can also say that that will affect very, 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 very few people in terms of the actual game. There are not that many of us who actually have access to every single class, right? And are going to be so annoyed that we're constantly doing them back to back. That will affect so few people that I don't think it's that big of a deal, and it's reasonable considering that even the repeats have a very different start and a very different ending to their artifact quest line. We might end up in the same place for the middle, but the reasons we're going there and the stuff we do after that have all been very different. So I think that's okay. The amount of people who are going to be affected or be disappointed that there are, a few repeats are absolutely in the mega minority. It would have been absolutely new. It would have been absolutely great if it wasn't the case, but it's okay. It's okay. It's not that big of a deal, but it's one of those things that you're just like, you mean you made all these? Could you not have just gone that little bit further and done one for each? Was there a reason that you decided to sort of not do them? Because it's just that kind of like sloppiness that we don't expect to see, or we don't want to see. I don't want to see that sloppiness. If you've done so many, why not just go the extra mile? And while part of me can be very forgiving and be like, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. But still, it would have been nice if you just didn't do that. If you didn't have this sort of essence in there. But we could also say maybe they're going to change. Maybe that's the placeholder artifact quest line. We don't know. I've got to say, as suspected, the artifact quest that involved the story, like the Ashbringer, have certainly been the weakest in terms of the gameplay. And they've had to work extra hard at the back end of that stuff to make it interesting. But they've done that well They've absolutely done that tremendously. I kind of knew that most of the artifacts that were fictional or sort of created recently, they would have to not only set up that weapon as to why it was cool, and then push forward into making it interesting, and then giving you a good reward at the end of it. They had to do that all through the artifact questline, whereas the ones that already had an established backstory, they already had done like 50% of the work already, so they had to do something a little extra at the back end. And it's worked out great so far. I will say that there's definitely a discordance going on with the idea that you are constantly having rammed down your throat how ultra amazing you are, and you are the only person in the universe who can fucking find this weapon because it's super awesome, super powerful, absolutely ball-slapping amazing, and you go there and it's super easy to get. And there's a good reason for that. The reason is you can't progress Legion without getting it, and that means it absolutely has to be designed for the absolute worst player in the game, because they cannot, Blizzard can't release a game that you can't get past the tutorial area. And in terms of Legion, it is absolutely the tutorial area. You cannot progress the game without getting to your class hall. You can't do that without your artifact weapon. So it makes total sense why it is this way, but suspension of disbelief is a very big deal. But if you're only playing like 1 or 2 characters, it's fine. It is still very strange to me that they reference your history so much, such as you did this and that and you are this hero, when they're offering a level 100 boost, meaning that you can have your heroic deeds can be hitting the login screen. But still, for the fact that most people will be using established characters, I think that's okay. In general, it's been pretty fine. It's just a case that you have to kind of ignore the fact that you're constantly excuse my cough, please. You're constantly being told that you are the only person possible to even manage the mammoth task of achieving this weapon. Yet you get there and you're like, wow, I can't do this. On that note, though, I personally didn't fail any of the artifact quest lines, even muddling through with broken specs and stuff. And I thought initially that they were super, super mega easy, like I've just told. But I've also know there are lots of people who have failed them. So I've no doubt they will be made even easier than we've seen right now. I'm sure you guys have seen videos or streams of people who are just going in to have a goof around and then they're getting killed. They're failing them. But what I have seen so far, and it seems to be the case for nearly all of them, is if you fail, generally speaking, there are NPCs that will finish the fight for you, or you'll come back and resurrect and run back, and in a lot of them, not all of them, but in a lot of them, you will actually find that the NPCs have carried on the fight for you. I never saw an example of it because I didn't fail them, but I am told that that occurs in lots and lots of the artifact quest lines, as they simply just carry on, and they will get done. So, that's kind of okay. That's kind of okay for me. Let's move on to the zones then, as we've just talked about the artifact weapons. So, the artifact weapons play a huge part on it. Where would I rate the zones? Let's start off with the first zone that I did, which was Highmountain. We have access to 2 of the 5 zones right now, which is Highmountain and Stormheim. Now, in terms of the aesthetic, Highmountain is very low on my list. I'm not trying to bash things here, I'm being completely honest. I got an absolute Miss of Pandaria style vibe from Highmountain. It certainly did not, just to put it in some sort of category, it did not match up to any of the Burning Crusade zones. So you're looking at Shadowmoon Valley, Nagrand potentially, although the floating islands for the first time they were implemented in the game was very cool. Netherstorm, Blade's Edge Mountains, Hellfire Peninsula, and that watery toss pipe, although it's a shithole zone to level in, is still very cool. That's very cool. It didn't stack up to any of the Wrath of the Lich King zones. Howling Fjord, maybe, but Howling Fjord had plenty of cool areas in it as well. So did the Verkul one, or Verkul as I've come to call it these days. But it certainly doesn't match up to Gundrak, or the Storm Peaks, or Ice Crown, which were fundamentally amazing. But we've still got 3 zones to go. So, and the Val Shirar looks very interesting from a distance. You can't get in there. That looks very cool as well. And they certainly don't stand up to any of the Casa zones. To Uldum, to Vashir, to Hyjal, to Deepholm. They potentially could be compared to the Twilight Highlands, which only had the one interesting tower there, but it still did have that interesting tower. Highmountain has absolutely no great aesthetic moment to it. None at all. Very plain Jane. Very much a mountainous wilderness, which is okay, fine, but we are like years beyond the zones I just mentioned, which just managed to take that idea and just run with it and do something super cool in there, because it's a fantasy game at the end of the day. And saying, yeah, it's Highmountain, so what did you expect, Preacher? A big high mountain? No, I expected way more than that because this is a fantasy game full of cool shit. And I wanted more cool shit in my... I don't want Highmountain to just be a Highmountain. I don't appreciate that anymore. I want my Highmountain to have something fucking mega awesome in there, and I want that every single time because why? It's a fantasy game, and I want to play around in a fantasy world where weird shit happens, like floating fucking islands, and I want to see an entire zone made into a city. I want to see that kind of stuff. So for me, Highmountain was very plain Jane. I can't remember anything that stood out for me whatsoever, and I got a very Mr. Pandaria vibe from it, which is something I didn't enjoy any of the zones, maybe Dreadwaste, but as most of the zone was locked behind like daily quest bombing runs and stuff, it was okay aesthetically, but yeah, Highmountain is kind of weak sauce on my list. I will say, though, I had the absolute best time doing the story in Highmountain. Now, obviously, I'm not revealing audio spoilers, but you'll see the characters down below. The reveal, the best thing about it for me, and there's a stark contrast here, the best thing that I had occur for me in Highmountain was that the major lore characters that show up in Highmountain were all people or NPCs that have played a major part in previous expansions without having to be very in-depth in the lore. For somebody who's not that interested in the WoW lore, to see people like you see below pop up out of nowhere, I was like, that's cool. Not only do I totally get who that is, I have some history with them. I know how powerful they are. That is intimidating to me without having to go and look and read the books and stuff in order to figure out who these guys are. As much as it's really cool for the lore guys to see NPCs pop up and be like, oh shit, that's that fucking guy, and get a really good experience out of that. That's awesome. For somebody who's not interested in that, it was very cool for me to see people pop up, and I was like, I know who that is as well. I can relate to that, and that's because Blizzard made these guys prominent characters in previous installments of the game. And that made that experience very badass for me. However, when I spoke to Noble about it, about what his favorite zones were, he got an absolutely separate vibe. One, because he probably doesn't believe that those characters are anywhere near his favorites. And Stormheim, if we move over to Stormheim, it's the other zone, Stormheim used characters and NPCs which had little knowledge to me whatsoever. Very little, besides a couple of the major characters. And reference things like beginner starter quests for certain classes and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what? I mean, you could ask me, for example, and this isn't related to Stormheim, it's like the Goblin starting zone. What do you remember about that, Preacher? If I'm being honest, I remember a volcano went off and I rode around in a cool car. There was something in a bank. And that's about it. Do I remember the names of Fizzlebang or whatever the fuck was in that zone? No, I don't. I don't really care about that. I wanted to get out of that zone and get my character leveled up and capped so I could do things with him. And that's the way I play the game. So Stormheim is very different for me. And it also contrasted nicely because Stormheim was much more aesthetically pleasing. Stormheim has an almost absurd amount of reference to the From Software game Bloodborne. And I say that as somebody who's only played extremely little of it, but the benefit of having streamed that zone and having emails and feedback and being able to talk to other people, it was absolutely gobsmacking how often Bloodborne was referenced in that zone. In fact, Dark Souls as a whole, some people mocked me, very few, but some mocked me for pointing out that one of the Artifact quest lines take place in a zone that is literally ripped from Dark Souls. Almost detail for detail, including the mob types, the abilities those mobs have, how they play, what they're doing there, the design of the area is ripped entirely out of Dark Souls. And it's clearly an homage. There's no question about it. It's an homage to that. And that's fine. Blizzard's done that lots of times. But then to see that the Outlaw Rogue has huge amounts of references to Bloodborne in terms of how it plays. And even after playing it for 10 minutes, I was like, okay, yeah, someone played Bloodborne and was like, this is really cool. Let's turn that into... We could call it a pirate in WoW, but it's essentially the same thing. But Stormheim has lots of townscapes which are clearly based on that, and even has lots of dialogue references and characters within Stormheim that reference Bloodborne as well. So I don't know who was the head designer, but clearly they had a big fandom for that game. Not that I'm complaining, but because that look is really cool. You know, one thing we can certainly say about Bloodborne is that the aesthetic is nice, and obviously somebody had a huge boner for that game. It was far more aesthetically pleasing, one for the Bloodborne aspects in terms of the towns, but they also had the huge statues. Now, but a part of me was also thinking, yes, this huge statue is super badass. This is what I'm talking about. This is what was missing in Highmountain. However, this is something that was in lock mode down at the launch of this fucking game. It was at the front of Ironforge. This is still nothing really new. But it's also fit inside the Warcraft universe, and it has to make some kind of sense. So I kind of get it. But again, it's part of me that says, you know, I kind of don't care. in terms of the aesthetic of a zone, this isn't a class balance or a game balance thing, something that makes it extra badass. But I can also counter that by saying the last third of Stormheim takes place in an area which is super gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, and is loaded with brand new mob types which are absolutely fantastic. As is the Shattered World where the Demon Hunters start. Their area is tremendously beautiful. It is beautifully, it's dark, it's evil, it's sinister, it's nasty, but it's beautiful all at the same time. And I have no problem with that. Stormheim was definitely a pickup for me in aesthetics. It still didn't blow me away, which is what I'm trying to say. I didn't walk in and go, oh my god, this is awesome. Now, I did feel that going into Icecrown. I did feel that when I first entered Stormpeaks to see those looming towers up ahead and be like, do we have to go the fuck up there? How long is it going to take us to even fly up there? That is crazy. The same as when I walked into Hellfire Peninsula and saw those red desert wastelands full of portals and lightning shooting from the sky. Shadowmoon Valley, which was being bombarded by demonic fire and fell flame. Or, you know, those similar zones in Catan to see those looming pyramids and statues and being like, this is cool. I saw the knackered, broken version in Silithus, but going into Uldum and seeing it all there, and seeing, you know, the pylons that you're about to activate, and going into Deepholm and being part of the shattered underworld. Those kind of moments have yet to exist in Legion, and I'm hoping that the other 3 zones certainly pick up on that. I think that'd be super awesome, and something I'm very excited for. But the story of Stormheim, getting back to that as a conclusion, was far weaker for me. Like, far, far weaker. The Bloodborne references were cool. The obvious Game of Thrones references were cool. But the actual story of the zone, I lost interest a lot. Now, part of that might have been because I streamed it. So I have to put that caveat in there for full disclosure, is it absolutely could have been because I streamed it. And I had the stream chat there who were talking to me and I was conversing with them. So maybe I was less focused on the story. But I picked up on the story all the way through. In fact, the only thing I missed was the very ending of the story, which had a slight reveal to it. And the final cutscene was actually missing. So I can say without a shadow of a doubt that there is far more for me to see and understand about the story of that zone, which may change my mind on that. But needless to say, it was pretty cool, but I preferred one over the other, as simple as that. But for me so far, Highmountain's story was fantastic, especially the last third. I was absolutely engrossed in that. So big shout outs to that. I thought that was super cool. Let's talk about the dungeons then. I haven't released the dungeon content. Why? This kind of goes back to the class discussion, okay? The reason is, the dungeons one are super buggy. You crash constantly. So you can either have no crashes or you can have sort of 10 crashes while doing the dungeons, which is very annoying to get a small a playthrough with commentary going on without having to chop it into pieces and give less of a feel of the flow of progression through there. So I'm hoping the next build will actually cure that and we can do some good stuff. The other part of that is the dungeons were altered in difficulty super quickly. Like, I can't be sure of how many times the dungeon difficulty changed. But they were ultimately nerfed super heavily. One, to counter the fact that certain classes were broken. One, to counter the fact that the only healers you could possibly get in the Legion Alpha were Mistweavers, because they were the only activated healer. And that some people, and also to counter, I think they underestimated what it'd be like, because nearly all the DPS classes have lost a huge amount of their defensive capabilities. So you've lost lots and lots of defensives as a DPSer, and some people were getting crashed and then punished absurdly high. So that created a bad environment, so they nerfed them heavily. It's also why the tanking and healer stuff isn't going to come out before the next build. I'm truly sorry, but the reason for that is there's nothing in the dungeons when I filmed them on the Prot Warrior or the Blood DK that will give me any sense of feeling as to how those specs actually are. Like, I can work it out as a DPSer because at least I can level. I tried leveling as a Blood DK, and it was just the worst experience ever. And after doing the Artifact questline on the Prot Warrior, which is ultimately very DPS focused rather than tank focused, it was clear that was going to be an even worse experience. So I'm not going to release them because I couldn't get hurt in those dungeons. I was just stood there, DPSs were dying around me, I could crash, log back in, still fine. All this was going on, and there's no way. I mean, I tank as a main, okay? I know what I'm talking about here. I've done like 10 years of tanking, and I can tell you right now that any opinions I could draw on tanking in Legion so far would be ridiculously pointless. Ridiculously so. And I can't even really tell you how the playstyle affects, especially considering warriors are now based on actually getting hit to generate rage, big scare, and that Blood DK's received huge overhauls, including new talents and a lot of not yet implemented spells into their abilities and stuff. So there's a lot of waiting to be done there. The dungeons, which we did have access to with Black Rook Hold and the Halls of Valor, are gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. So beautiful. Black Rook Hold is the weaker of the two so far, but the atmosphere and the feeling of climbing that tower and going through the various stages gave me a definite Karazhan vibe. Nowhere near as varied as Karazhan for sure, but ascending, there's something quite cool about ascending a tower and fighting your way to the very top, to the pinnacle, to fight the ultimate bad guy at the top. And the mechanics, while easy, were interesting. Halls of Valor is far more gorgeous, which is obviously intended. It's supposed to be gorgeous. And I mean gorgeous as in absolutely beautiful, not like creepy gorgeous, such as Black Rook Hold. Halls of Valor is just flat out beautiful. Breathtakingly stunning. It contains everything you would expect to see from that theme of zone. Everything that you would want to see in there is in there. It was perfection for me. The bosses were very cool. The mechanics were very cool for a beginner. And everything that I expect from a normal mode leveling dungeon was experienced in there. It was super easy. I expect it to probably even get even easier, as you tend to have a higher class of, a higher caliber of player on alphas. Generally, not always by any means, but you generally do, than when you unleash it upon the masses. So I expect it to get even easier. Now, on that note, let me finish up with some thoughts regarding the dungeons. What was hugely apparent is that certain mechanics that you would have expected to see in dungeons were not there anymore. And I have absolutely no doubts whatsoever that is because they're supposedly being re-implemented, or going to be, I shouldn't say supposedly, are going to be re-implemented in the challenge mode system as the tiers build up. So we saw things like there was no real enrage mechanics, and that's because enrage is confirmed to be part of the challenge mode situation, yeah? They're confirmed to be the challenge mode situation. So it's almost like you look at the 5-mans as being an LFR. Now, don't lose your mind there, because these are leveling dungeons in the first iteration of Alpha we've seen. So some context there, people. It's more a case of these are introducing to you to, 1, what the dungeons look like, 2, what the mobs kind of do without punishing you too hard, and not having mechanics that can actually really kill you if you play even half awake. Which is fine for their purpose. We might see a slight advancement in heroics, and then ultimately preparing you to step into the challenge modes, where they'll introduce the mechanics that we kind of expect to see, certainly at like Kata, TBC heroics, right? Those kind of mechanics. Not really the Wrath of the Lich King or the Mists of Pandaria stuff, which was absurdly easy. We're talking about getting to a reasonable dungeon difficulty level is probably going to start with challenge mode 1. From the judging of things, if I was to make a really wild and pointless speculation right now, and I would expect challenge mode 1 to be something that you would compare to heroics now. Okay? That's what I would expect to see. That pretty much wraps up where I am with the first iteration of Legion Alpha. So I hope I've covered most of the topics there. The pros so far, in conclusion, the pros so far is it's fresh, it's exciting, it's interesting, but we've had less than a minor taste of what is to come. We can only get to level 104. We can only unlock a few of our artifact traits. We only have a smattering of specs that don't seem to be working correctly in any form across the entire array of them. So we've had basically a taste of what is to come. The big focus for me in Legion going forward isn't really in this alpha to beta phase. It isn't really the class design. That's going to be more towards the end of beta, although I will do some. It's going to be, what is the end game in terms of outside of raiding, outside of dungeons? What have they done to solve that problem? Have we evolved, or has WoW evolved from the Apexes daily? Has that system been abolished in favor of something else? And what have they come up with? Is it enough? Is it interesting? You guys know I went into Tanaan and I knew within 20 minutes this was 3 weeks of content max for most people. It's so clear to see when we see it. So I'm hoping that I'll be spending most of my time looking at that stuff and giving feedback on that and trying to ensure, for everybody's benefit, from casuals to raiders to PvPers alike, that if we're not online with our friends, if we're just going to sit back and play and do something outside of mega organized content, that content is there and it's cool and it's interesting, and hoping and praying I can give enough feedback to that to make it as good as possible, which I hope everybody else is focusing on as well, and combining our voices in that regard. Right now, we've got a very limited taste. Those are my feelings and concerns so far. I'll be interested to see how that changes with the next iterations, and I'm I'm leaving curiously pessimistic. Or cautiously pessimistic, I should say. Cautiously pessimistic about what is to come. Alright, guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope I covered everything there. Please leave questions in the comments if there's something I missed. It's a big topic, so probably I have. Have a great Christmas, guys. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.